Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Royal Drawing School's Creative Conversation series. For tonight's conversation, I'm really delighted to welcome Matthew Travers and William Feaver to discuss Frank Auerbach's celebrated portrait paintings and drawings through the experience of the model and sitting. And it's a significant moment to be reflecting on this theme as this conversation coincides with Piano Nobile Gallery's current exhibition, Frank Auerbach, The Sitters, which was curated by Matthew and I believe is the first exhibition giving a dedicated overview of the artist's portrait heads. And to anyone listening in London, if you've not seen the exhibition already, I highly recommend seeing this beautiful, beautiful show before it closes in mid-December. So just to introduce our speakers a little more, Matthew Travers has been director at Piano Nobile since 2010 and is a specialist in modern British art and a graduate of the Courtauld. He's curated many exhibitions, including from Omega to Charleston, The Art of Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, along with exhibitions on Leon Kossoff and on Walter Sickert. Matthew advises clients from around the world on their acquisitions and works closely with leading museums and institutions, as well as representing the estates of prominent British artists, including Craigie Aitchison, William Crozier, and R.B. Kitai. And he also edits the gallery's ever-expanding publications programme. To join Matthew in conversation, we welcome William Feaver, who was for many years the art critic for The Observer. He's also a painter and a curator, notably curated exhibitions on George Cruikshank at the V&A and the Tate retrospectives of Michael Andrews and Lucian Freud. His book, Pitman Painters, was adapted by Lee Hall for an award-winning play at the National Theatre in 2009. And he's the author of books on Frank Auerbach, published in 2009, with an enlarged edition this year. And in 2019, he published the acclaimed Lives of Lucian Freud, which was shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize for nonfiction. And Royal Drawing School alumni will also know William for his teaching and conversations with artists at the school, including one featuring Auerbach in 2007. And he has also sat for Auerbach since 2003, and so will be sharing his insights on this experience. So a warm welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us. And to all our audience, just to remind you all, you're very welcome to leave questions in the chat and Q&A box, and we'll come back to those at the end. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you both.
Wonderful. Well, Claudia, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to be here and to think and talk about Frank Auerbach's work and discuss it with Bill. And I think I was going to screen share. Should I do that? Do that at this stage. So it feels very appropriate because Bill has been instrumental in discussing and thinking about the show we have on at the gallery at the moment on Frank Auerbach, and we have been talking about it for some time and had thought about what would be an interesting angle to take, and it struck us at the gallery that no one had ever done a kind of overview of just Frank's heads, and actually, you know, they're such a key part of his work. I mean, really, his heads or landscapes, there's a few nudes and other things along the way, and to look at the work, to focus on the work from the 50s. 56 in this case, all the way through to a recent work from 2020. And that actually started with the idea of looking at drawings. And they're a key part of the exhibition, because of course Frank's charcoals and graphite drawings of many of his sitters, including Bill, aren't in any way studies. They're finished works conceptually. They're the same as the oils. And it was discussing that with Bill and thinking of perhaps doing a show of the drawings, feeling that perhaps it would be a shame to leave out the oils, as the two go hand in hand, and that's where we that's where we started. So, Bill, I don't know if you have anything at this stage to add, but I thought in combination with discussing Frank's work with you and the portraits, we would also run through a few images, installation images of the exhibition for those who haven't been able to come, and then specifically look at a few of the works in the show as well.
Yes, well, let's start with the pictures, shall we? Running them through if we can.
Yes,
you enter Piano Nobile, which is former shops, aren't they? And two galleries.
Yes, indeed. Originally, I think not so relevant perhaps for this, but the building we're looking at now was in fact a dairy, and if only there were still more site-specific dairies in London, but that world seems to have moved on and changed.
Dairies or art, it's one of those final dilemmas, isn't it?
Indeed.
You can see at the first glance that these are extraordinary pictures. They're not sort of portrait gallery, large National Portrait Gallery type portraits, although some of them qualify as that, I suppose. They are absolutely in their own right, strong, memorable, and size is really of no account. Even the smallest have got this extraordinary vividness. Furthermore, I think I've contributed a few photographs to our talk this evening. But what strikes me immediately is the way in which the red paint on the painting on the right-hand side, which is a portrait, just is a sort of extraordinary add-on. And I think, as we'll see as we go through these paintings, there is in Auerbach's work an extraordinary way of getting a realization of someone and then capping it and adding to it and showing that everything's a sort of work in progress until it's reached a certain state of liveliness or depth or passion or just sheer gossipy interest. And it's something which then stands up and takes off independently of the artist, of the circumstances. It's a whole thing in itself. So shall we move on a bit and look at...
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's always amazing the intense power of the works that and I know Frank's talked about this, and that he was very, I'll move on if I can work out how, excuse me. He was very, he felt he used to hang his works too closely. And I think once Catherine Lampert was curating a show and encouraged him to hang them further apart. And he was very pleased with the results. And they do need space. They are, although often with the portraits in particular, literally life size or perhaps only slightly bigger, they have a physical presence as strong as any real human. And again, these are the first two works in the show, 1956, Head of EOW and Corresponding Oil from 1958.
Early photographs of Frank sitting squatting on the ground on the Thames Embankment, and with paintings, early works strung up on the fencing behind him. Wonderful photo op. I think it got into Picture Post, but actually, of course, he's quite right. The pictures do need to be seen sort of in isolation. I think these two are very close together in thought, style, and personality. This is Stella, who was his first great emotional entanglement and life with her in early years. And it's so remarkable, isn't it, the way in which in charcoal on the one hand and in just earth color paint in the other, you've got an impression of this actress, mother, profoundly involved with Frank, and who only died a few years ago, and Frank kept her supplied with books and things to keep her exciting, lively, and of course the works she did of her are as lively as anything he's ever done.
I think that's amazing, but in case for anyone who doesn't know that, I think Frank moved in, and without being indiscreet, I think this is all very published information. As a 17-year-old, he moved into Stella's house as a tenant, with her and her 3 children living there, and I think quite quickly they became involved. And although a lot of people early on, and as you still do, Bill, go to the studio, I believe a lot of the works Stella would actually always he would go to her rather than her come to him after he'd moved out. And although later on she banned charcoal in the house,
Yes,
because of the extreme amount of dust and mess it would make within.
Well, that's dogged Frank throughout his life, because that's why his studio is a splendid relic of charcoal of yore, charcoal of days gone by, half a century gone by, and it's strictly material, and the material is transformed in this way, which is on one hand historic, conventional, on the other hand absolutely bold and brave and moving out, and this is just post-war, really, in effect, right through into the 50s.
Very much so. And I think the next shot is also probably quite appropriate because, of course, this is the other, I guess, great love of Frank's life. And we don't necessarily intend this to be a talk on a biographical talk of moving through all the people close to Frank through his life. But however, so many of the subjects were, and in total, over a long career, part of that show we published in the catalogue a full list. I mean, the information was readily available in Bill's Rizzoli book, but we distilled it down into 2 pages, a full list with a brief explanation of each of Frank's sitters and who they were. And there is only 40 of them, which is rather amazing. And in fact, particularly the works from the 50s and 60s, and then later, I guess from a Bill from about when you started sitting too, are remarkably consistent. There's only 4 or 5 regular sitters. It seemed to be more the 70s and 80s where there were more. But again, an amazingly beautiful drawing of Julia. I think Helen Lasaw described these early drawings she showed at Beaux-Arts Gallery as almost old master-like in their quality, and I think although they really worked. This is not superficial, charcoal marks the easiest to do. You can see it's almost like finger painting, and actually no, it's not like that. It's been developed and rubbed out, and there are bits where the paper's worn through and he's added patches, and they become thicker and denser, and this is extraordinary, lovely sort of El Greco light that falls on them. But this is just the beginning, of course. Yes, very much so. And then I know, Bill, this is the work you asked to include in the list of images. It's amazing early head again of EOW.
I think one of the points of these paintings, which are in the 60s, he's well on his way by this time. You look, being human, you are curious. You look and see, say, this extraordinary mess of sort of tube paint, sort of squeezed and splattered, and then suddenly you realize there's eyes looking at you, and there's a mouth and there's a nose, and there's the head of hair, and all the details start emerging, and it's a sort of trick in a way, trick of the light, that as you move around the painting it changes slightly, and it might become a kind of Madame Tussauds exercise, semi-animating dummies, but no, this is actual paint used to speak, and speaking likeness is a cliche, and they are speaking likenesses. They are likenesses with all this extra dingle dangle of scarlet, this amazing ability to get a painting better, stronger, more surprising, more awful sometimes, and then becoming amazingly a finished work. Unexpectedly, usually after months of work and labor on it.
I think particularly these early ones too, that the technical ability to produce that is fascinating, and I often think with Frank's work there's a level of craftsmanship which is so integral to it, because without that understanding of materials, albeit chalk and paper or board or canvas, they could so easily go wrong. And having handled a good number now over the years, I'm always amazed at their even with the early works from 50s and 60s, their intense strength Of course, on the whole, they've all been looked after very well and in box framed under glass, but rarely do you have any issues of kind of structural problems in the paint. It's very well bonded, and although that doesn't necessarily become apparent, I suppose, in the finished image, I guess Frank thinks about that.
It's a postponed image, or it's a image left as it is. It's got there, and it can now take weeks, months, years to dry out.
Yes,
this is cousin Gerda, who was.
Is that something you ever discuss, Bill, in your sittings? The techniques behind it. I mean, in terms of the technical side of painting, some artists have full-time technicians and studio assistants. I know Frank works alone. So, like, do you witness obviously not just the creation in terms of the painting, but the kind of the other aspects that go behind creating such a work?
Well, Frank is not very fond of dogs particularly, but I am fond of dogs, and I think a dog's perception, sort of sniffing things out as much as seeing them, listening for things. Frank's paintings bring out a way of interpreting and a way of listening and a way of communicating, which is uncanny, really. It could be such a mess, and indeed they are such a mess very often for the months and years that they take to accumulate and become a finished thing. The eyes, the mouth, the angle of the head, the restlessness of this painting is quite extraordinary, and it's done without pretension at all. It's just the way he's come to work, which is to press on and demand more and more of what he's doing, and then, which is very important, have them make the editorial decision that that's it, that's hatched, that's ready, and off it goes. He doesn't keep pictures hanging around, and so to put them in the gallery is quite a change of status. Suddenly they become lone, carefully selected, nicely framed and mounted images, and it's strange. It's rather like sending one's child off to school. They're out in the world, and they're different from the first day when they come back. They've experienced the world. These paintings experience time, and they don't change at all.
I think I'm conscious that we must, whilst discussing this, Bill, move, because we've got I think quite a lot of slides if we want to get to look at them, but we don't have to.
We must rattle on, I think, mustn't we?
Okay, but again, and I think what you've been saying, that this is only showing more moving in the gallery from a room of 60s and 50s and 60s works through to one of my favourite little parts of the show of 70s paintings, and we spent some time getting a group of 70s works together, and in particular a series of heads of JYM. Who he met through EOW, Stella West, and was a friend, and Frank painted for a long time, but was also a professional model. And I believe Frank's said in the past that he felt he could push a bit further with JYM because of that, and she was quite inventive with her poses. And I think this is a remarkable. The work develops, I guess, quite quickly as a turning point from the late 60s, 67, 69, like the head of Gerda Byrne we were just looking at, into the works of 70s. And I guess, and again, Bill, that's probably something you've discussed with Frank in more detail than I have. The scraping down begins of the paint in a way that it was before he was building up and not scraping. The process of redaction and then putting back on is more apparent, as it was in the charcoals, perhaps, in the 50s and 60s, but not the oils. And well, it's a lovely series.
It's a form of reference that Frank could have been an actor, was an actor, in fact, for a short time, and has a huge admiration for actors and the way they put themselves out, and the way, of course, that they develop characteristics which are the performance, and that things memorized get relived. And it's it'd be quite easy to carry on with this sort of slightly specious comparison of acting and painting. But the act of painting is an act of conveying life, even in all forms of abstraction. It can be, it should be, if it's any good, an extension of life. And these strange paintings, which belong very handsomely together, but they show someone absolutely used to sort of sitting and nodding off and feeling very secure and not in good hands. And the paintings are sort of in good hands. And you start noting these huge slashes of final application. This is something which makes the transformation possible. You are showing that the painting isn't a finite thing. It's completed all right. I mean, it's out in the world. But what happens is that the boldest strokes, apparently, and I think generally quite obviously, are the ones that go on last. It's like a kind of a passing salute or a dismissal, or it's like the audience's applause, and this is the actor over the footlights, sort of freezing in the condition they were at the end of the play.
That's beautifully put, Bill. And I think also might be a good moment to think about too a question I wanted to clarify with you for a while. Here we have three different poses of JYM, one sitting up with her head turned, one lying with her head sort of in profile, and the furthest one on the right from 1972, with her lying with her head on the pillow or on something, and then looking down at a slightly foreshortened angle on the top of her head down to her chin. And how, in your experience, how kind of how firmly do you have to hold a pose? Does Frank in a sitting expect you to maintain it precisely through a 2-hour process, or is there kind of talking and gestures going on, and the relative position is held, but not always exactly?
Well, one sits there in a chair 6 feet away from the easel, because that's the right proportion in certain size. The one is diminished by 6 feet in size away from the easel, and so one's put in one's place very definitely. Frank grunts and then usually comes up with some sort of remark that's he's prepared earlier to set us going talking. For many years he had it that you just don't talk while working, but he rather likes it. It's a good way of exchange of gossip. And this means that the painting, being an acting profession product sort of thing, means that he can be talking about who's the best Hamlet of all time, who's the best Scrooge, and familiar patterns of conversation in which there is only 2 rules. One is that one doesn't start it, and B is one doesn't interrupt too much, because one's got to keep one's head still. Because if you relax at all, it's, William, did you move a little bit? And one feels thoroughly ashamed of oneself, and taciturnity is restored.
Okay, so he keeps a beady eye on any movement that may occur. That's very interesting. And
well, of course, the painting lies between us and him, between me and him, and this applies to all his sitters.
Yes,
and we are not exactly transfixed, but we're kept in a state of suspension. This one, which is of Bruce Bernard.
Yes, again, I hesitate. This isn't in the show, but I was an image Bill I know you wanted to include.
He's a great mutual friend, and he was a picture editor on the Sunday Times magazine, and he was a great historian of photography and a great devotee of Lucian and Frank and the others of the group loosely known as the School of London. And this is, to my mind, one of the great drawings from the earlier years, because I think partly because I knew Bruce well, and characteristically we would mutter, and he'd be very, very lugubrious, and he'd come out with some devastating joke, a very feeble joke, but all the better for being feeble, and absolute passion for works of art. And he'd carry crumpled photographs in his pockets, which he'd bring out and say, isn't that marvelous, isn't that marvelous? And was a failed, as he saw it, painter in his own right, but actually, and none of us ever saw his paintings, but actually his presence was enormously powerful. Freud painted him a couple of times and drew him, and Frank did too. And it's there could be a special gallery for Bruce Bernard and himself.
Very much so. I think it's a wonderful example too of that kind of overlying structure you were discussing in the oils as well, Bill. Those heavy black top lines of charcoal, which were inevitably probably put on last, and give the work this overlaying lattice structure, which.
Well, it's what will happen as we go through these pictures we've chosen. I think that charcoal is in some ways the easiest material to work with. You make a mark on paper and there it is. But actually, on paper, eventually, it's a very powerful medium, and he liked it and used it up in enormous quantities. Sharing a studio with at the Royal College, he exhausted the entire Royal College post-war charcoal supply, really, and claimed to be sort of almost ankle deep in the dust. And then the paint, of course, is a different process. Paint is malleable. Charcoal isn't so much, except by rubbing it and scrubbing it. And yet, here, the function of charcoal has been taken over by stripes of paint, and you can see that actually, from every angle, it's necessary for a person not to have moved, because slightest deviation from what's gone before is, well, it means redoing the whole thing. And of course, the process of painting is redoing the whole thing all the time.
Yeah, I think this is a interesting work to pause on for a second, Bill, after Bruce Bernard, and I know we briefly passed over an EAW, but another one of very much that early 70s, wonderful example of that, the lattice and structure we're talking about in oil. But this drawing of Loriot, or head of Loriot, I should say, is part of an interesting, relatively rare group of works painted in oil on paper. And it struck me that I think for about 10 years, from the late 60s through to the latest, mid to latest 70s, Frank obviously wasn't quite getting from charcoal what he wanted. And there's a number of works that started life as charcoals on paper, and he would paint over them and they would become oil.
Well, there's a terrible snobby appeal, and that things on paper are not quite as important as things in oil. No, I guess absolutely ignores that. A drawing takes as long as any painting, or as short as any painting, but it's never really that quick. And so they are equal in his eyes and equal in our eyes, I think.
I always think these few works are a wonderful bridge between the two, where works on paper, charcoals on paper, and oils merge, and they conceived very beautifully, particularly in the early to mid 70s.
They do take a lot of looking at. I mean, you don't exhaust them on first glance. They have impact, but it's the more you look, the more you see, and the different moods and different lights. They are sort of alive. I mean, there's so much expressionist painting which is just shouting and bluff and sometimes mess. To actually be able to handle painting this way is something which is very special to, I suppose, kind of Western art. Oil painting art, basically, charcoal redeemed from being messy and becoming actually expressive.
Well, I think they don't just show a moment. They show a series of many moments, many hours over perhaps months or even years. And within that, I think there's very much a sensation of the individual, the presence of the individual, which Frank manages to capture.
Yes.
And, again, we've seen here through Bruce Bernard, who I don't think perhaps no more than twice, and Loriot in the same, a kind of a number of sitters in the mid 70s, and that period, I guess, in the 70s and 80s, when Frank was less regulated in his sitters. But as one of the, I suppose you've been seeing now, I guess, since 2000 and 3 thereabouts.
20 years, yes.
Do you find that how do you incorporate that into kind of daily life, or weekly life? Is it
well, everything stops on Monday night, and I go slightly earlier nowadays, but it's the absolute fixed thing on the calendar. The only other thing is to go and see one shrink, I suppose, and in a sort of way it becomes rather like that. It's 2 hours of sitting, talking. In my case, we talk an awful lot, but usually in the second hour it's more silent and total silence. But on certain days, certain stages, that he's a bit distant, a bit vague, a bit abrupt, and he says he's not going to talk at all, and he thinks he might just do it today. So there's always this sort of it's almost like horse racing, I think. Top form, top everything, all the circumstances underfoot and overhead correct, and you just might produce some extraordinary, glorious victory. And there's a kind of sense of victory when he puts the picture down on the floor and says, well, I think it just might do.
So you perhaps feel as the work becomes closer to being finished, you feel the sort of the intensity of that in the room.
Well, it's not so much finish as ended, I suppose.
Ended, yes,
it's independent life starts. No, he always says he can't tell. Once or twice, I think it's one picture we're going to come to, happened very quickly, almost in one go. But that's very, very rare, and in his eyes, suspicious. It doesn't have the depth, the weight, or the enduring power.
Well,
Something else.
I keep moving forward, Bill. This is again a lovely work on the show of when Frank starts using charcoal and paper again of Catherine. I suppose that the longest sitting of the current sitters, I suppose, apart from Julia.
Yes, Catherine sat for
40 years. Well, this is in fact the second
late 70s.
This is in fact the second work Frank produced of her. From 78, 79 when she started sitting, and then we jumped across into the next sort of part of the show, the first part, and I think it's quite a clear divide between the early work from, say, the 56 as we have it to the late 70s, and then what one might describe as Frank's kind of more mature style of although he may not agree with me, of the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and that's where, as our kind of dual buildings, the show divides, and now we're seeing an insult shot from the second part of the exhibition,
yes.
And a number of heads. Well, the one furthest on the left of Catherine Lambert from 2000, which is rather amazing because it has such similarities to the drawing of her from 78, 79. So there's amazing consistency in that sense.
Yes, of course there is, but also remember this, over this great length of time, it's all been concentrated in one place, and
very much.
At the same time, there's always one large painting on the go, usually a landscape or a cityscape outside. And so there's always, the full 24 hours is taken care of by Frank in his long working hours, and love of absolute repetitive routine in which everything has a sort of almost ritual quality, getting the picture worked up to be allowed to be set free and live its own life.
I wanted to include this work too because I think it's a wonderful example of his scraping back in a finished work. In fact, this work almost entirely, the background is left untouched from perhaps the scraping before, and the fresh paint of the last sitting.
It's a marvelous painting. Cousin Gerda, his second cousin twice removed, I think.
Yes,
she was. She was a rather disagreeable person. She was always complaining, always grousing, and he didn't have conversations when he painted or drew her. But she was useful. She was around for some years, and he did marvelous paintings of her.
Yeah, very much.
Cantankerosity.
And she's certainly one of the consistent sitters for the first 30 years of his paintings. But I love the scrapings on the left, bottom left and top left, and again I no doubt you often witness the scraping downs.
Well, there's one of Michael Podro,
yes,
a great friend of his who also taught at various art schools and became professor of art history at the University of Essex. You can forget all that. Look at this place, this slightly quizzical, highly intelligent, nice man with a splendid wife and family that Frank thought for a while could be almost adopted as his spare family. And look at the extraordinary, one eye's green, one eye's red, the unruly locks of hair, the big ears. It's almost a caricature in some ways, but actually it's very sympathetic and affectionate and modest and absolutely brilliant painting. And this is really unlike anything that's been done before. One could hark back to Rembrandt and Frans Hals, say, but it's just different. It's got something which I think was one of the great themes of the 20th century, life of individuals. Picasso did it a lot, and Sickert did it a lot, people that Frank admires so greatly. But actually Frank produced Frank's paintings, and it's nothing to anyone really.
And I think the individuality of the sitters is something that's certainly come across in the exhibition and something we've thought a lot about. Often if you see the works in isolation, you can appreciate them for the paintings they are, and one's mind doesn't necessarily perhaps turn so readily to the individual in the work and what the work gives back of them. And I certainly think, as you say, that's something that all the works do. And again, here, this is an interesting view. This is actually Michael's wife on the left, Charlotte, and in the exhibition there's a group of works of Charles and Michael Podro, two charcoals and two oils. And I think rarely are there a husband and wife pair that Frank has painted and drawn, and it's wonderful to see those together. And in fact, one of the Podro's daughters says this work of her mother, in terms of presence and likeness, is quite uncanny. She much more so than other images. It really gives a sensation of her in the room. And
painted drawings like these are a celebration, I think, and celebration is life force. And one of their daughters said that particularly the heads of Charlotte Podro, mother, a sort of compensation almost for having her mother having died. And
yes, that's amazing.
So characteristic, and it's a great comfort.
And I think that aspect of the work, as you say, is something that is perhaps hasn't been drawn out so much in the past, and I hope there's more writing on in the future, and more thinking about it. Of course, that becomes harder as the individuals who either are in the works or knew the individuals in the works are less and less around. But certainly.
But steady on, Matt. I mean, these things stick up for themselves. They don't really need us babbling around about them. They are, and they outstare us.
But very much so. Well, but I think the comparison of presence is always an interesting one, and can in some cases can be done. And then we move on. Another install shot of the exhibition, a lovely head of JYM peeking out on the left hand side. Again, that wonderful upturned pose, which Frank did a series of in the early mid 80s.
And she loved sitting, and she came all the way from remotest South London to sit. And this was a ritual which became a kind of pilgrimage, would be pretentious. But she really, it helped. It gave her life extra meaning, and I think it's a very strange thing to have yourself sort of used in this way, and completely without resentment, of course, because it's a very great treat in life.
No, I think, and I think that's a very interesting part of the work. And oh no, I have included her close up. Sorry, I forgot about that.
Yes, it's
and you can see the kind of amazing intensity in the paint. I often think too that there's quite an interesting divide in the work from say the 70s to the 80s and onwards. And I think that's highlighted here, where Frank seems to mix more colours on the canvas or on the board, rather than keeping them kind of straight out the tube, more primary. And you can certainly see that going on in the background, this wonderful mixes of mauves and greens, and then the kind of wet on wet mix of green and yellow and kind of a crimson red.
And it's wiped. The space around the head is wiping rather than brushwork.
Yes.
It is, I was saying, like stage performance in the sense it's distanced, it's slightly artificial, it's somebody assuming a character for the purposes of a play. The process of here of the portrait, well, it's more a head rather than a portrait, but
yes.
it's so vivid. It's a kind of wonderful bonus.
Well, as you say, they and you have experienced yourself, Bill. I think they do absolutely take on their own life, and they go out into the world as individuals in their own right, as paintings. And I'm always amazed, and I think that's Frank's genius, that works can. And this is probably a good example too of two heads of Julia. There's lots of heads of Julia, as there are of JYM. He usually asleep. He ekes out something new in every oil, every painting, every drawing, and that's kind of an incredible ability to do.
Well, it's the definition of love, isn't it? In a way that you are there, you are confident, you are kept tantalized. There's all these emotions, which are actors' emotions as well. And here they're not just acting; they become genuine. They are genuine. Yes,
very much so, very much so. And I think again they capture a likeness, but I think more than a likeness too, and
living, breathing sort of.
Yes, isn't it? Very much so. And interesting, I suppose, here to talk about perhaps the acrylic too. I know that on the whole, the heads of Julia have been painted in acrylic from I suppose the last 30 years, as Julia.
Tenancy agreement that inflammable paint shouldn't be used in this flat. So the flat where Julia lived at weekends was meant that the use of acrylics, because acrylics don't burn, whereas oil paint does. And that's the practicalities of an artist's life also have a strong bearing on what they do, I think.
I've always appreciated too Julia's reference to sitting for Frank as likening it to doing the dishes. That there's this wonderful for her as part of domestic life, daily life. Perhaps in a way, as I'm sure it's become a routine that, as you say, it's an excursion out into the world that takes you into another place and perhaps gives a respite from your kind of normal goings on. But I think for Julia, it's so ingrained in life that it's.
I'll tell my wife about, but yes, there's a respite. I think it's actually much more positive than that. It's sheer confidence.
Yes,
you can go to sleep and something's going on while you're asleep, and there it is, and you rely.
Well, that's very true. How many of us can say that we're being productive whilst being asleep? That's very true indeed. And here we are, Bill. Finally, 2003. I think the first one of the first works Frank produced of you. And can you remind us how that came about? What was what spurred on your kind of long sitting for Frank?
Well, there was talk of a new edition of a book by Robert Hughes on Frank, and I said I didn't mind doing an edition, but I'd not clear it with him. And he said that's fine, so long as I get the royalties. He got the royalties.
Yes.
Anyhow, we decided no go, and I would do a new book, which I did. and it was an initiation which meant a ritual pattern had developed. Once this drawing was finished, which took about, I can't remember how long, it took about 6 months, I suppose, he looked very, very preoccupied and brows knitted, turning round. And he said, I suppose I have got this idea. Maybe would you? So I said yes. And after he'd done this about 6 times over about the course of 4 years, we dropped the pretense, and it's just assumed that I was a sitter.
Yes.
And it was just a remarkable feeling to have one's decisions made for one, I think. Decisions like this.
That's rather amazing to hear, and I've always appreciated this particular work too for its for that, and it's back to hear you talk about the process of producing it.
Well, of course, it's the problem of eyewear glasses, and the problem with Frank is that the glasses are a bloody nuisance for anybody using them, and there's a sort of a suggestion of glasses, but not entirely there. And all those details are things which can trip a portrait up altogether.
I think there's a wonderful work too, which you have illustrated in the exhibition, of Stephen Finer from the 70s again. And Stephen, to this day, still wears incredibly heavy black trimmed spectacles. And
yes,
I think Frank deals with that very well. And in fact, before I knew him, I didn't even read them as spectacles. They just seemed like structural marks on.
Which they are, yes. Spectacles are very tertiary, not even secondary items. They come and go, don't they?
And I think if you can bear it, Bill, we come on to 2 more works of you as well, which I know perhaps you would want to. I'd be fascinated to hear as we're here in front of them, your immediate impression of seeing them on screen. I know you've seen them in the exhibition and are kind of.
I've seen them in the exhibition, yes,
and of course I've seen them being created. So, but what do they bring back to you? Is there? Do you see a likeness in yourself? If we can go, I know we've talked about the likeness a lot already, but what's your immediate reaction when looking at them?
It's quite distant, really. At the point where he says once more under course, and he thinks he's really getting somewhere, he gets very, very intense, and then the thing's done. He flings it on the floor, and normally he just places it on the floor at the end of the session. And one thing you mustn't do is talk about it and say that's really rather good, because that's sort of curtains for the picture. But you can grunt, so I grunt, and there's dogs grunt in different ways. One could say that one thinks one's being supportive, or whether one's saying that it's just another week's gone. I have to confess that I'm not so much interested in the look of myself, and I find the paintings of others more intriguing. But that's because I'm not intrigued by myself, I think, perhaps. It's interesting to see what he makes of things. Over the decades, I've lost a certain amount of hair, so I got practically none on top, and so the crowning glory is very much departed.
Yes.
And so it's quite comical in some respects. I think particularly the one on the left. But my mother-in-law said, "Such a pity he paints you, Bill. You should do something more interesting."
I think that's unfair of her. So.
Very unfair of her, but she meant it in the best possible way, that she would make a jolly good sitter. She wouldn't.
Well,
she wouldn't have shut up.
I'm sure she would have put on a good pose. That's for sure. But I think compositionally too, they're interesting for thinking of that kind of thing. He seems, particularly from the kind of 2000 onwards, to weight the eyes in a very interesting way, and you see that in the drawings too. And I think both the right hand eye is given a presence that the left isn't, and I've noticed that comes across in many of the works. And I can see, Claudia, you've come back, but I'll continue through. Just we're almost at the end of our slides. I think, Bill, perhaps the work on the right is the work you're referring to which happened almost in one sitting.
That was pretty well one sitting, and that I thought we got to include, because he could do it with great speed, and that's just like doing the 100 yards, isn't it? And it worked. But normally it's 3, 4, 5, 6 months per picture.
How that must have been quite an exciting day to be starting a process that was going to normally take months, and there it was all in.
Well, it was, but he was exhausted by the time he'd done it, and so it wasn't.
Was it longer than normal sitting? Was it?
No, it wasn't. It was quite. It was very, very rapid. And he put it down, and it was out of sort of not quite believing it, that this is a distance runner suddenly doing the 100 meters, and I suppose I recognised myself there, and that, but I'm not really that interested in myself, I think, and
yes.
It's rather convincing us ahead and convincing us a real shape and real proportions and expression, and
I think certainly as a painting, it's incredibly convincing in itself and very resolved, and every mark feels as it should be, which is an amazing achievement. And then again, the man himself, and I think the self-portraits, which there are 2 of in the exhibition, are again rather fascinating. I know Frank didn't paint himself for a very long time, and started in I think 2012.
Well, he wanted to do himself more, and he was always rather embarrassed by his sort of shaving mirror appearance. But COVID got him doing an extraordinary series of self-portraits in the last few years, which are touching and moving and really splendid. And
I think you really see the difference here of 10 years in them too. And I know he said as he gets older, he finds his face more interesting as the contours and the lines intensify. And I think perhaps you can very much see that here. Yes. And they are really, well, the self-portrait along with the late Head of Julia are the last 2 works in the exhibition.
Yes.
And then I think there's some interesting studio shots here that you've by you, Bill.
Yes, this is my studio shot. This is Frank suddenly noticing his wet socks are hanging up to dry in the radiator, and the slight breach of etiquette. And then behind him, his heroes on the walls, Rembrandt, of course, Picasso, Hogarth, and Rembrandt banged up together. Yes. And it makes perfect sense to have them with Dürer below them, and Matisse, sort of as though he's got chums at his elbow, helping him on. That would be very pretentious if he said it, but I can say it, I think, and say that actually there is a continuity between Frank and the great Dutch and the great North Italians, and his love of Picasso is the love of the sheer energy and exaggerated perception and things which keep him going and alert.
I've just seen actually in the bottom right-hand corner, just showing itself, Wendy Barron's tome on Sickert. Yes. Of course, being the bridge perhaps between all of that, or some of it at least. I know Frank wrote an introduction to the 1981 late Sickert Hayward catalogue, Hayward Gallery catalogue.
Yes.
Their show, and we, having done a show of Sickert's work last year, it felt very appropriate to follow it up, and that was partly the thinking.
Another of your lovely catalogue books too, which were such a treasure.
And then I think it's wonderful, to see his paint trolley, and I guess again, courtesy of you, Bill, a wonderful photo of those beautiful primary colours and how they can be, the
stuff, yes, used in quantities, large quantities, not quite as much as they used to, but they are vivid colours that then meld into new colours and new arrangements and thoughts and organisation.
Frank's been in the studio since 1954 when he took it over from Leon Kossoff, yes. And of course since then has, I believe, bought it, it's his, But do you think the studio is beyond being a practical place to work, has become kind of important to him in a more spiritual sense, or do you think the location is important? I suppose is what I'm asking.
Yes, I think wherever he would be would make the location important, but it's a place that he's absolutely fixed in, and it's all designed to produce works. I added this one because it shows the beginnings of a drawing, and it's really rather feeble. This is not developed, and so this is exactly as it should be. And it will take another several months before this drawing would have been finished. I haven't identified which one it is, but that's sheer laziness on my part, I'm afraid. But
I think it's fascinating to see that process, and I guess this is prior to a sitting beginning, but there's no top lines on it. It looks like it's been reduced or rubbed out to an extent.
Well, it starts off as being uninquisitive, uninventive, and then gradually things happen, things alert, and things work out, and things become at the same time more obscure and more illuminating. It's an extraordinary sort of juggling act that these paintings represent, and the drawings.
Have in your time, has the studio changed much? Is it a place that very much, apart from a few pictures rotating and moving around and going in and out, is it a place that sort of is stands still, or is it a place that changes regularly, as a kind of someone who goes weekly, so to speak?
Well, you notice the smallest change, the books left open on the floor. That's very much so. The mirrors, which not just for self-portrait, but also for adding extra effective space. Sketchbooks, which in well over 20 years haven't been touched or opened or looked at, but are there. It's a kind of monumentally useful workshop. Got to his satisfaction. High windows. Actually quite smart. It was done up in the well, several times, but in the last, not all that long ago, and a perfect workplace. It's a practical place. It's not a glamorous place, and it's a place for working practice, reaches such triumphant conclusions.
And I guess as any good working place should be, and are your regular sittings still taking place there?
Yes, I'm Mondays, and the others are Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday sometimes. So
I think it's just rather amazing that what wonderful to see the work change over the course of a career, and as the show does, but also this wonderful consistency. And within our exhibition too, there's also, and I photograph we're looking at the moment is by Nicola Bensley, and Nicola went to see Frank in 2015, and just in a couple of hours, she only works in 35 millimeter film in black and white with natural daylight. Took the most extraordinary series of photographs of Frank in his studio, showing the studio and showing him.
He's been very polite. He likes it clearly, but he really is thinking of getting on with things.
Yeah, yes, I think that's very true. And I think probably the last time Frank was photographed, and of course here he's in his mid-80s, but I think has a kind of a strength in him.
He's 91 actually.
Yeah, well, no, in this photograph he's in his mid-80s, but yes, now early 90s. But it has an amazing strength in him, and that's a compilation of the series of 8 that we've published with Nicola for the exhibition, and are very much part of the exhibition. I think add a wonderful dimension to be able to see the man behind the brush, so to speak, and the
laughs behind the series.
Exactly. And I think that, you know, one perhaps in some of the earlier photographs of him, you're normally confronted with the more austere artist in his studio, and I think Nicola captures with Frank beautifully all the perhaps other aspects of his very warm, it seems, and erudite and charming personality. I think again we end on a couple of install shots of the exhibition the two Julias, the Michael and Sarah Podro, and then Bill, you peeking around the corner, far left, and again the two oil heads of Michael and Sarah Podro, and then the last work in the exhibition is a very beautiful reclining head of Julia from 2020, in fact a lockdown painting. And I think thinking back to that early 1960 charcoal of Julia, how what a wonderful arc to a painting like this last one.
I thoroughly recommend it, and people should go and see it. And it costs nothing, which in 25 quid hardly gets you into exhibitions these days. It's to be thoroughly recommended. That's
very kind of you, Bill. And I must admit, everything in the show comes from private collections or institutions where they're not normally seen. In fact, they're all from private collections, and some from other parts of the world as well. So it is a wonderful opportunity to bring together a group of works which otherwise might not get examined so closely. Thank you for your insight, Bill. It's always fascinating to talk to you about your experiences and amazing interrelationship you have with Frank and his work.
Let me second that thanks, and thank you both. I'm reluctant to draw this conversation to a close, but I know that there are people listening in the audience who have questions, and we could listen to you for many more hours. But thank you both so much. Such an absorbing conversation and illuminating for you. And I found it a very moving exhibition. I was really moved by that sense of the sort of intense physicality and presence of the sitters, which I think you evoked too in your conversation, but also the sense of human frailty too, which I think comes across, that fragility. And I don't know if that's bound up with texture too, that dialogue between the sort of scraping back and that incredibly tactile, sensuous surface.
Making something real, I think it's. I think the acting side of Frank is very, very important, and the marvelous way in which sometimes at the theatre you're just uplifted and taken out of yourself, and the paintings do that as well. It's good painting.
One feels too that perhaps the reworking helps, and Bill, you may totally disagree, helps Frank identify perhaps a bit with the materials and the sitter, and this kind of constant going over them perhaps obviously allows to see and develop new and deeper understandings of what's in front of him, both physically and perhaps emotionally.
Yes,
and that mobility of the face that he retains.
Yes, you can see around them. They're not cubist works, but I think his love of Picasso is interesting, and there is often a sensation that you're kind of, although you're seeing one particular stance, you're seeing much more than just the head in front of you. You always feel like you can see round the back and to the side and under the chin, and I think that's an amazing.
Well, there's a great sense of love, I suppose, and in the most serious sense of that, and it applies also to his friend Leon Kossoff, way in which paint becomes a real language, and a new language, and a classical language. They stand the test of time too. They are the test of time in a way.
Yeah, there's a question from one of our listeners, sort of evoking, sort of reflecting on that, saying, do you think these paintings and drawings almost grant an eternal existence to the sitters, a permanence in paint?
Well, one doesn't want a Russian bomb strike to destroy them, but given the vicissitudes of life, they share the vicissitudes, and they survive, don't they? So I think that's why people we love works of art that take us out of ourselves, yet also talk to us.
I would concur with Bill, and I think they have a universal. I think that's a very interesting thing. Actually, they have a universal sense to them, which ultimately speaks to, I think, anyone across the course of time. I mean, if you were, if you were a caveman, or perhaps someone in 3,000 years' time, hopefully you would look at these and immediately understand it, or certainly without too long, understand it as a human head. And although to an extent perhaps abstracted or warped or given a certain impression, they have a universal understanding to them as humans that I don't think will go away. And in that sense, I think they do stand the test of time, and give the sitters and the artists, they go out into the world, as Bill says, and become their own.
There's another sort of comment and question, connecting to that, about how the portraits have different lives depending on where you look at them from, and how long you look at them, and about how they seem to require shifts in the angles in which they're viewed, that straight on isn't enough. And I think that's a true point to make, because it is also about long looking and close looking, and looking in the flesh. I mean, they can't really be captured on screen, but this gives us a sort of glimpse.
It's definitely the case, Claudia, and even it's always the same, I think, for Frank's work, that and not just Frank, many great artists, whether in paint or sculpture or other mediums, the more one looks at them, the more they open up, and they only get better and better. One can't tire of them. Like a great piece of music, you see and hear more things, and or a great novel.
A good rule of thumb is, of course, that really good paintings don't photograph well. Much that aren't quite so good, but maybe entertaining and amusing and moving, photograph much better.
And as an exhibition too, it's been on now for some time. We've got a few more weeks to go, but we're over halfway, and the spaces and the works still feel incredibly fresh. In fact, I often look at the room and think, oh my God, I've got I don't feel nearly au fait with all the works as I should at this stage. And I think that's because there is so much to look at, and they constantly renew themselves, and every time you look at them, you see them afresh, and that's an amazing thing to be able to achieve. They walking into the exhibition, it feels as fresh as the day we hung it.
Yes, I was also really struck by the sort of luminosity of colour and the vividness and range of tone, and perhaps wrongly I'd sort of associated Auerbach with a sort of more sombre palette, and I don't know if partly in the exhibition, if it's this sort of the effect of seeing the charcoal drawings alongside the paintings, that they sort of electrify each other in a way. But there's another question in the sort of from one of our listeners about colour, and you did reflect on colour a little bit, but there's a question about the artist's use of colour, and does its final appearance on the canvas reflect the hue of the moment, or is it a byproduct of constant expressive revision? I
think there comes a point on the last day of a particular painting when everything is thrown into this, and it's risk, and very often, usually, in fact, invariably, probably, it doesn't quite work. So the fresh paint is just going to get scraped off and back next week, and we'll start again, or go on again. It's almost like athletics in a way. You train and train and train. You want to beat a record for yourself rather than necessarily in competition, and you put all your energies into it, and you don't quite know how you do it, where that extra strength comes from, or in this case of painting, the extra. The dance of the brush on the canvas. It's a messy business that sometimes goes right, and surprisingly right, and that's when good stuff emerges. And there it is.
I think yes, I would. You see that in the work, as Bill says, and I can certainly think of examples where Frank must have thrown, as you say, Bill, everything into it. And in certain some of the drawings too, a colour appears that you wouldn't normally get, wouldn't normally expect. There's, for instance, in the show, a wonderful drawing of David Landau, which out of the blue has this electric blue zigzag going down one side of the head, and then this bright red, pinky red mark in one of the eyes. And he's obviously decided that day that color is required. And I think that's actually very interesting too. Yes, it's seen in the charcoals, but also the paintings, using line as structure, but also color as structure. And I think whether oil or paint, they all come from a place of amazing draftsmanship, and being able to draw and paint. I think Leon Kossoff actually used to say, "Oh, it's his highest compliment for a work was of any size, scale, particularly the National Gallery. Oh, it's a drawing. If it were, albeit the most finished of oil paintings, and that ability to maintain great draftsmanship in the stickiness of oil paint."
And one of Leon's favourite remarks was, "I just don't know how it happened." And there is a kind of, and I know exactly what that means and what it is. It's perfectly true. You can just, hands and eyes move involuntarily. Most of the time it's a terrible mess, but then there comes a time when it cracks it.
Well, that feels like a good moment to draw to a close. But I want to thank you both again for such a fascinating conversation, and for sharing all your insights, and Bill, your experience of sitting for Auerbach. That was really wonderful. And just to urge anyone who's in London before, I think, December the 16th to go and see this exhibition.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And good night to everyone listening. Thanks for all your questions.
Bye-bye.